The waistline is changed. I feel it in the belt. I feel it in the trousers. I feel it in the skirt. Much of what was lost, for I have spent a lot of time exercising. Please don't sue me. Okay, so I've already prepared some of the leather. I've got a cut already across the bottom where I've made my raised Skywalker belt. And whilst I was stressed out at work and working from home, I quickly nipped into my craft room and I've marked on in very slight blue chalk the outline of the belt. So what I'm going to do now is just line up my metal square with the chalk lines, then I can use that as the guide for cutting. Okay, so now we've cut out a strip of leather. That's the belt blank. You could just put a clasp on the end of that and call it good enough, but we're going to make it a little bit more nerdy than that. So what we're going to do before we can do any sort of carving or decoration onto it is soak it through. Now how wet you want the leather, if you ask a leather worker, you'll get an answer. You ask another leather worker, you'll get a different answer. You don't want it completely soaked through, generally speaking, people will say, because then your leather can get mushy. What I'm going to aim for is about 2/3 soaked through, with the back still being dry. So we're just going to wet all the way along and then give it a few minutes to soak in. Now, as you're working on a long piece of leather, it's probably going to dry out as you go, but resist the temptation just to wet one area and move and just work with that, and then move on to the next one and wet that one and work on, because if you do that you can end up with patches, like when you clean your windows you can end up with streaks and watermarks and things like that. So every time you wet your leather, try and wet all the way along it to try and give it that kind of even coat. That's good enough. So I'm just going to leave that for a few minutes to properly soak in and dry. Well, not dry, but start to dry off, have the water soak into it, and then we'll begin working on it. As you can see by the lines on my cutting mat, the belt itself is about 3 centimetres thick. And the writing that I want to do on there, Tengwar, the Elvish writing, has a writing system with bows and sticks. And the sticks go above and below the bows. So I want to keep my writing as best I can in this centre centimetre, with the bows will be in this centre centimetre and the sticks can go above and below. I've written out the phrases that I want written onto the belt. So I can see that there are 64 characters including spaces, so I might be able to knock some of that down because there's extra space in some places between the phrases. And I want to have each character being roughly a centimetre long. So the writing is going to be fairly small, but I'm going to draw on first freehand with a stylus, just because it's a lot easier. If you were trying to carve in like a particular pattern, Celtic knotwork or something like that, you might want to trace an image first, then use a tracing paper and transfer. But because I write with Tengwar typically anyway, I'm just going to transcribe directly on. So I'm going to leave first. I'm going to go with leaving 2-3 centimetre gap, and let's start here. Okay, now that the Tengwar is all written out, I'm going to start using the swivel knife to carve out the actual letters. Now with the swivel knife, I'm still very much a beginner myself, and this is a fairly difficult tool to use. But the basic gist of it is you hold it like a pencil with your finger rested in the cradle at the top, and you can use your two fingers and your thumb to both guide the turning of the knife and apply pressure to either push or pull. And what I've found is when doing a curve, to curve in one direction it's easier to pull, and curving in the other direction it's easier to push. But you might find it different, so you've got to experiment with it to see what's best for you. So the way we'll carve in is you place your knife at a 45-degree angle onto the leather this has been re-wet, and then drag it over down or push it up and make your carve into the leather, following where you've already tooled it. Now it's better to do light and with a lot of control and do multiple passes than it is to push hard and get everything done in one solid pass. Okay, and now that I've cut, rather hacked the Tengwar into the leather using a swivel knife, I'm now going to use a beveler just to stamp in shading along the edges, just to try and make it look more than just like a slash in the leather. And what I'm trying to do with this is build up one side and leave the other side smooth. So on this one, the F, the inside of the bow is curved in, so you've got a gradient going around on the inside, and then on the outside, on this side, it's a sharp line, just to give that three-dimensional effect. And to remove some of the tooling marks, because the ends of this do have a hash on them, what we do is just place the tool in and rub along. Ideally, if you've got one that a tool with out any of the marks on, it'd be a lot better for this, but just rubbing along will remove some of the tool marks and soften the shape. And now that we've come to the end of a phrase, I want to put some sort of stamp in there, some sort of design. So I'm going to go with this leaf pattern that I'm just going to place in between, just to separate out the phrases. And now that that's all done and all the lettering is 3D and textured, what we're going to do is bevel the edge. Now this is an optional step, but it really does help make your work look a lot more professional. And the way we're going to do that, this is dried out overnight, but I'm going to re-wet it. Just to make sure, I'm wetting it all the way along to And we're wetting it once again all the way along to make sure that we don't get any streaks. We're particularly going to wet the tops and the edges. Then we get our edge beveling tool and we just rub along. Now the idea with this is we're not trying to get lots of pressure on there, it's more the heat and friction that's going to bevel the edge. What we want to do is find the appropriate size notch, which in this case is the most narrow one, and we just want to rub backwards and forwards, plenty of heat and friction, and what that's going to do is round off the edge so it's not quite as sharp and jagged and rough. And this is the difference beveling edges can make. This one has been rounded on the sides. And this is the other side I haven't got to yet. You see it's all square and rough. Okay, so when it comes to dyeing a leather, there's a few things we need to prepare beforehand. Firstly, we need to make sure that we've got gloves on, because this dye is designed to dye animal skin, and guess what my hands are made out of? So always want to make sure you've got some sort of gloves on, be they rubber or silicone or something, depending on your allergy. Then we want to make sure that we've got some sort of plastic against the surface that we're working with, just so that any dye that comes out won't stain whatever surface we're working on. And then on top of that, I've put some brown packing paper, because the leather dye will pool onto plastic, and so we want something that's going to soak it up afterwards. When you're working with leather and you're dyeing it, whether or not the leather's dry is a personal preference. Some people like to dye it wet, some people like to dye it dry. The only thing to keep in mind is that if you're going to dye it wet, you need to make sure it's evenly wet up all the way across. It's, as it is now, if you see that we've got some patches where it's dried out, because I've been working mostly on the edges. If I were to dye this now, we could potentially end up with uneven colouring all the way along, as the dye will probably more easily move through where the leather is wet, so we'll end up with darker and lighter colours going along it. So we need to make sure that firstly it's evenly wet all the way along. And of course, if you're going to dye dry, then you don't need to worry about that. I normally do dye dry, but I'm a little bit more pressed for time at the minute. So I've gone straight from beveling to dyeing. Then we want to take an ordinary sponge. There are several different ways to dye leather. This is the simplest way for just a hobbyist setup. It's just to take a sponge and your leather dye and just apply the leather dye to the sponge, either by putting it in something, a container that you can throw away afterwards, or by just putting it on the sponge and then just rubbing it along, as I shall demonstrate. We want long, even motions for dyeing it, rubbing the dye down. Once it's sufficiently dry, turn it over and do the same to the other side. Okay, so after the dyeing, this is how it looks, and as it is, this is good enough. You could just put the fastening on and wear this as a belt. There is one more thing I want to do though, because it's all one colour, and because normally with leather carving you don't have lettering this narrow going along. This is particularly narrow because that's just the style of Tengwar. With a lot of leather carving you would want to make things more ornate and larger. Not really possible with Tengwar writing. But what we can do to make it stand out is to gild it, which is something I'm going to do now, and I'll just show how we do that. Firstly, grab ourselves some gilding paste and a relatively fine paintbrush. Take a small amount of the gilding paste and as carefully as you can paste it into the lettering. And the thing we want to be careful of is having the paste spread across between the different strokes of the letters. We want to keep them very distinct and separate. So we want a very fine amount of gilding right at the edge where we've stamped in. We've created a slope going down and a hard edge, and we want to put the gilding paste up against the hard edge. And once I've got to the end, well, probably once I've got about halfway, this will have dried enough for me to actually apply the gilding. So I'm going to carry on doing the lettering all the way down with just the gilding paste, and after about 5-10 minutes, depends on the sort of paste you're using, once it's got tacky basically, then we're going to come back in with the gilding and put some silver leaf in there. Lettering's all done. Just a little bit that needs to be scratched off around the sides, but largely that's done. Now we need to do the attachments for closing the actual belt. For most instances you'll probably want something that's adjustable, and in that case you'll probably want a classic belt clasp just to adjust it to the particular holes. In this instance however, because it's just going to be me wearing it and it's not entirely for holding up my trousers, I'm just going to use some press studs. We want to use 2 of them, because if we just have the one, then once we close up the other end, that becomes a pivot point. So if we put it on and it's still slightly loose, it can twist. But if you've got 2 in place, then if it tries to twist, it will pull against the other one and it won't go anywhere. It doesn't matter what orientation they are, but I think I'm going to put them side by side just because the width of these are a bit close if I put them that way around. So we want to make sure we've got them in a good distance apart before we make the holes, because if we make the holes first and we haven't checked, we could end up with a case of there's not enough space. I've had those 2 holes punched. Need to make sure that the other holes are lined up, so I'm going to put the belt on. Once we've wrapped it up in its sort of position we want, push your stylus in and just make a dent into the leather, and that'll give us a line for where we want to punch the next holes. Okay, so when it comes to placing the press stud on, what we want to do is take the cap, place it in an anvil, make sure it's on the convex side so you don't squash the top. Push the lever over, upside down, make sure it's the right way around so that bit's facing the front. Then place your back onto it. Get your little stylus of a hammer and just give it a couple of good whacks. then that. It's all good and solid. And so there we have it, ladies and gentlemen, in all variations thereupon. A Lord of the Rings inspired belt.